Okay, good afternoon. Year 13, exams tomorrow, so I'm going to be shooting through as much as I can. What am I doing today? I'm looking at performance and context. I'm going to go back to the tragic form because it's really important. I'm going to look at three scenes: Alan Gray, the rape scene, and the denouement in scene 11, okay? And you can stop me if you want to, or wait till the end and we could have some questions there. That's probably the best, okay? So first of all, performance context. Don't forget when the play is actually produced, okay? 1947. It had been started earlier by Tennessee Williams. It had been germinating in his head. But I think setting it with Stanley coming back from the war is very important. It was first showed in New Haven, which is where Yale University is. And secondly, it then moved the next month to New York, okay? For those of you who are interested, Tennessee Williams had a catastrophic failure called Battle of Angels, but then the Glass Menagerie had made him very famous. And it's worth knowing a couple of things about the Glass Menagerie because you'll see some embryonic ideas. I'll talk about one or two of them in a minute. We've got Marlon Brando as Stanley. He was completely unknown. And the idea was that Stanley would be older at first. Marlon Brando was only 25, but it was central to Tennessee Williams' idea that Marlon Brando should be young. You've got Jessica Tandy, who's about 38 years old, British actress. Just like the second Blanche, Vivien Leigh is also a British actress, playing Blanche, okay? And you've got Elia Kazan, the most famous director in the United States at the time, very famous for the Actors Studio for pioneering method acting. That's when you become the character. Now, a lot of people were used to the theatrical style of Broadway. Now they're going to have Brando with his sweaty armpits and his looking very macho and menacing, and it's going to come as a huge shock. So one of the things I'd like you to do in your essay is show that you understand the shock value of this play in 1947, yeah? And you've got Joe Malziner as the set designer, incredibly famous. I'll say a few more things, using what he calls scrims. That's the transparent walls. Same year, Arthur Miller, the great contemporary of Tennessee Williams, produced All My Sons, another tragedy that's redefining tragedy, also 1947, and it's worth knowing a little bit about Arthur Miller, and I'll go into that in a moment. So what's the immediate historical context that you need to know about? You need to know about the returning soldiers. One of the most powerful readings of Stanley is that he is a war vet with PTSD. We mustn't forget that he survives, I think it's Salerno, isn't it, the Battle of Salerno, and he boasts about his luck. Just before the war, America was in a state of unrest with the Great Depression. You had a lot of labor unrest, and that is perhaps why it's so important that Stanley quotes Huey Long and says that he is the king of his house, isn't he? Yeah? And then we also, in the background, guys, have the beginning of civil rights movement, okay? So while we have this incredible racism from Blanche, we also have an embryonic civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King and everyone else is going to get really busy in the 1950s. You have very conservative views on gender, which I think are reflected in the play. A lot of women did work during the Second World War, and then during in the post-war period, they were told to go back to the house. And there was a real sense in which of patriarchy, a return of patriarchy. You also need to know about what we call the antebellum South. That's the South before the Civil War. In 1939 or 1938, Gone with the Wind was the most popular film in the world, and it introduced a whole load of kind of nostalgia and myth about the age of chivalry in the Deep South. You also have Jim Crow segregation laws still in operation. Our play is set in New Orleans. There was still segregation in New Orleans. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana were still deeply divided societies. And it's important you know about New Orleans. A lot of you made a mistake last time of talking about it as being in the north. It's not. It's actually further south. What makes it so important, though, is that it is an international, highly industrialized port with a very rich history. Don't forget, of being both French and Spanish. So one of the key things is that there's this kind of Latin thing going on. And the Latin thing, as I'll tell you in a moment when I talk about Tennessee Williams himself, is about this idea of sexuality and blood and the heat of the Latinness, etc. And that's all brooding in the background, isn't it? Yeah? And just my final point, by 1961, JFK will be the first Irish Catholic president. Why have I put that in? To remind you that the Protestant WASP ascendancy that Blanche stands for is being challenged at the time, and you can see Streetcar as being part of that challenge. The fact that Stanley is so angry about being called a Pollock shows, Polak, I should say, shows this kind of challenge to the white ascendancy of the old class. So Mulzina, what do we need to know about him? Well, he's one of the pioneers of plastic theatre, okay? And he did the set design. His big, what he really wanted to do, guys, was to make sure that you had no sense of comfort in the set, okay? That there was this kind of terrifying sense of the outside world coming in and absolutely, destroying Blanche's sense. Now, why have I put these quotes on here? Mulzina says, when I designed Streetcar, I used translucent walls that would appear to be made to have light and focus of the attention on the stage at any given moment. Throughout the play, the brooding atmosphere is like an impressionistic X-ray. That'd be a nice phrase to learn. We're always conscious of the skeletons in this house of terror. Lovely quote. So you don't need to remember the exact words, but you could paraphrase that quote, be very useful. And we also learn here as well. Kazan and Mulzina designed a steady beam of light, a halo of subjectivity to focus on Blanche. So you must always put the play on the stage, guys, and that is equally so for Othello too. Now, what was the actual reaction at the time? Well, there was a mixed reaction. A lot of people hated the play. A lot of people thought it was foul and disgusting, that Blanche was essentially a prostitute and she was an unmentionable character. But the New Republic, which is still going today, in their review, comes out with some really thunderous applause. And the play goes on to win a Tony Award. They say it's absolutely arbitrary. They talk about the production set with a back wall through which we can see the street beyond, with a steel staircase spiraling off to one side, going God knows where. So that dismantling of the home and of the interior and comfort is fabulous, because one of the things that you need to remember in your analysis is that we, the audience, are occupying Blanche's subjectivity, Blanche's mind. In his direction, Kazan caught the combination of southern rambling languor slashed by moments of blazing violence. So one of the key conflicts in this play is between different sociolects, different idialects, different speech patterns. And one of the ways that Williams really enhances the tragedy is by having Blanche speak in this incredibly poetic way. And in doing that, he reintroduces elements of the Greek epic, the epic style of tragedy. One of the things that you could write about is how this play combines realism and poetry, and it blends them into a new form of tragedy. So especially with Streetcar, please do not confine yourself to Aristotle. Don't forget that we're talking about the 20th century. Another thing that the New Republic says is that they talk about Brando and the effect he has on the audience. They say, most young men in our theatre seem hardly violent enough to complain to a waiter who's brought them cream instead of lemon, which is kind of funny, isn't it? Gives you a sense of all these kind of poncy theatrical types, and suddenly you've got Brando there, who represents a new kind of naturalism, earthiness, and this extraordinary method acting that he brings with him. Now, the French Quarter is important, guys. Williams loved it. It was like a thunderbolt for him. Williams was, like Blanche, was brought up in this sort of puritanical South, from sort of Anglo-French background in Blanche's case. In Tennessee Williams' case, a very British background. And he had no sexual experience at all as a young man. His mother had various kind of neuroses that I won't go on about in this recording. And here is a picture with him, with his very good friend, Pancho. Now, why Pancho is very interesting is that when Pancho and Tennessee Williams get together in a hotel, Pancho smashes all the light bulbs. And Tennessee Williams writes in his diary of being thrilled. Okay. Now, there are definitely, therefore, elements of, there appear to be elements of Tennessee Williams in Blanche. But we need to be very careful. As many of you know, I don't like the biographical fallacy. What does that mean? It means don't pretend that he's writing about his own life. The way you phrase it is say, it may be the case that Williams, it appears to be that Williams. Relevant biography is perhaps. You phrase it that way, okay? And here's a very, very beautiful point that I think is really interesting. When he first gets to the French Quarter, Tennessee Williams thinks about calling himself Valentine Xavier. So he's experimenting, you see, with a kind of Latin identity. Why does he like New Orleans? Because he can reinvent himself. So how about the fact, guys, that there's a bit of Stella in Tennessee Williams as well, isn't there? That he reinvents himself in the Quarter. He leaves behind his puritanical upbringing from his mother and has Stella-like elements to himself, okay? Now, claustrophobia on the set. This is a wonderful little passage here. Inside the apartment, there are no doors between the rooms, and there are only 2 rooms. Its inhabitants must undress, this is Kazan writing, undress in view of each other. Nothing is safe from the other person's scrutiny in such a space. It is significant that Stanley's first penetration of Blanche's privacy happens largely as a result of space and proximity, for there is no place for Blanche's trunk. So I want you to get a sense of that invasion of privacy and the way that everything appears before us. Of course, the only haven would be the bathroom, wouldn't it? Which is a very important part of the set. Now, in terms of form, I've got some quotations. Again, I'll make this PowerPoint available to you. But from Adler, a further distinction that sets Streetcar apart is Williams' ability to capture something of the complexity of the novel. I think this is really important, guys. In Othello, you've got the soliloquies, and that allows you to capture a sense of the complexity of characters' minds. What does Tennessee Williams do? Well, he doesn't use the non-naturalistic device of the soliloquy. Instead, he uses this amazing plastic theatre. What does it do? It takes us into Blanche's mind. Benedict Andrews, the director of the 2014 production, very, very highly acclaimed one. The play is written on the borderline between the real and illusion, the fundamentals of theatre. The mythic is one space of theatre and the tangible is the other. So there's a balance here, isn't there, between fantasy and hard realism all the way through. And in the Poetry and the Plumbing, great title, skillful incorporation of different levels of reality is an essential realistic drama. I think that that's a really interesting point. We have different levels of reality, don't we? And I'm going to do the Alan Gray scene in a moment, and you'll see what I mean by that. So the plastic theatre, you must speak of it, guys, okay? It's Williams' term. Plastic in those days was seen as something that you could mold, that you could change and shape. So you need to think about the scenery, you need to think about the music, the expressionist effects, the shadows on the wall, the locomotive, the jungle sounds, okay, the intricate lighting. All of this is really important, and above all, the polka music, okay? Previously, in his last highly successful play, The Glass Menagerie, Williams had used slides and photos on a slide machine. So he'd made his play kind of multimedia. Also, the center of The Glass Menagerie was a section of little glass animals, and the character lived in a fantasy world with her glass animals. So I think that Williams' theatre is really interested in illusion and fantasy and make-believe worlds and people who slip into these fantasy worlds, okay? Now, I've called this contextual and timeless because one of the things about tragedy is, generally speaking, it can't only be about the present. It has to have a wider, more universal significance. And Tennessee Williams said that the play does have that. Now, Tony Kushner says they're social plays. They're not plays that are completely interior. There are always ways in which A Streetcar Named Desire is timeless. And there are also ways in which it's very much a play of the postmodern era. I'm going to suggest that's the best way of dealing with the play. Yes, you need to historically contextualize it, but there's also a kind of Hegelian clash of cultures, two worlds colliding. I'll talk a little bit more about Hegel because I think it's a very useful lens to use for tragedy. Now, Williams on Stanley. Stanley's character is really interesting. In the kind of Me Too movement today, we're probably going to demonize Stanley. That's not the way that Kazan and Williams imagined he would be, okay? Again, I told you they wanted Brander, they wanted a young man, they wanted a man who was immature, but not evil, not somebody to blame, not so that he became the terrible nemesis, somebody who a hate figure, and a Iago. He's not a Iago. And in a letter to Audrey Wood, who was a very good friend of his, he said, I don't want to focus guilt or blame on any one character, but to have it a tragedy of misunderstanding and insensitivity. That would be a really easy phrase to remember. Misunderstanding and sensitivity, okay? Now that's not what Greek tragedy would be, is it? Okay? Greek tragedy would be about the gods revenging themselves, the fates destroying you as a result of your hubris of being so arrogant, etc. Now, it's very important that we have all of the Southern Gothic stuff. We begin with the Elysian Fields. We know that the tram line runs from Cemetery to Desire. We have the epigraph from Hart Crane, someone who took his own life, a very tragic figure, like Tennessee Williams, a hopeless alcoholic. We have the reference to Edgar Allan Poe, who is the kind of sort of godfather of the Southern Gothic. And we know that we have a quote on Mitch's cigarette case from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was herself sick her whole life. And I believe it says, I shall love thee better after death. So we have this extraordinary imagery, together with the fact that you can see why I've chosen this picture. There's a kind of vampiric dimension, a Gothic dimension to this play, almost to the extent that it's like a form of camp. There's a lot of melodrama. Some people feel like having the flowers for the dead and everything, that it really is a highly melodramatic play. And that is one of the reasons why it gets criticized by critics. Hart Crane, this is a really important quote from Tennessee Williams, okay? He said, I'm as much of a hysteric as Blanche. A codicil to my will, that's a legal document, provides for the disposition of my body in this way. Sewn up in a clean white sack and dropped overboard 12 hours north of Havana. So it says that he left that in his will. That's how he wanted to die. So it's kind of interesting. Again, we've got to be careful about that biographical fallacy, but we can see that Tennessee Williams wrote a lot of himself into Blanche, and he definitely wants us to have at least some sympathy for Blanche. Now, it's ingenious the way that he is able to capture the high speech which characterizes Blanche. How does he do that? He has her as a rather pretentious, like myself, and Mr. Brennan as well, school teacher, always dropping little literary references in, etc. And it gives the speech, doesn't it, a kind of highfalutin character, which gives it a kind of epic quality that contrasts with the naturalism of the set. And I would argue it gives the play gravitas. I set for my class an essay where I asked them to think about, is the play too everyday for Blanche to be a tragic hero? And I think that Blanche's speech takes her well above the everyday, the quotidian, okay? And as it says here, her long speeches, verbal arias, develop metaphors while building rhythmically to a climactic sentence. So it has something of the verse of Othello, doesn't it? Of Shakespearean verse drama. And I think that that's, again, an ingenious way in which Tennessee Williams is writing a new kind of tragedy. Right, now moving on to the idea of tragedy. You are all going to use your Aristotle stuff, and Mr. Brennan's going to do that in a minute, so I'm not going to say too much about Aristotle, other than Williams both uses Greek tragedy and also writes against it and does something entirely different, okay? George Steiner, who you see here, is really important because he wrote a book in the 1950s following Auschwitz in which he said tragedy is a dead genre, okay? So I think that's very interesting context for you, because what you guys can say is a lot of people are questioning whether tragedy can exist at all, and in response to that, people like Williams and Miller are taking tragedy in a new direction, and they are writing in a new way. Miller, in his brilliant little paper, Tragedy and the Common Man, which I suggest you look at tonight, he argues actually this slave society of Aristotle is ridiculous, and in sort of democratic America of the 20th century, we need a tragedy of the common man, and this can still produce tragedy, rather than just being a sad story. Now, I think Hegel is really important, because Hegel sees tragedy not so much as about one person, but about being a clash of worldviews, a clash of values. And we can see that happening in the battle between Stanley and Blanche. Clearly, they represent more than just private individuals. They have like a kind of dimension of historical, cultural, racial, and gender differences. And much of the play definitely takes place between this clash between them. John Leonard, who does the, John Leonard, not John Lennon of the Beatles, John Leonard in Massalet does a very good little video in Modern Tragedy where he says it is now a polymorphic genre. The original Greek tragedy, guys, would happen once a year. It would be a particular festival. So it was set in a kind of Aristotelian way. Now, it is, far more polymorphic and takes place in all sorts of different contexts. What does Williams say about tragedy? Well, one of the key things is Williams is interested in Greek tragedy, and he borrows a lot from it. Some of you know that he has elements of the Greek chorus, doesn't he? He has the lady with the flowers for the dead lady. He begins in Elysian fields. He has deliberate classical references, doesn't it? He's playing with the conventions of Greek tragedy. And in terms of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which is his play following this, another brilliant play with a character who is of the same persuasion as Alan Gray. I'll leave it at that because I'm doing a recording. That play comes closest to being both a work of art and a work of craft. It is really well put together, and he says it also adheres to the valuable edict of Aristotle, that tragedy must have the unity of time and place. Of course, Streetcar doesn't have the unity of time because it takes place over the summer. So like Othello, it's set in psychological time. Very stupid people sometimes will say to you, oh, Othello takes place over 3 days. No, it doesn't. It's a psychological fictional time. In the Streetcar, it obviously takes place over a number of months over the summer so that we can see the disintegration of Blanche. And this is all part of mapping her psyche. I put there Miller disliked, which is very bad. Maybe I'm going to change it now. Williams disliked the quotidian. Quotidian means every day. And what Williams said is, we shouldn't just have little people and inconsequential things. That's a useful quote, isn't it? Williams clearly thought that Blanche and Stanley's conflict wasn't little. And in a sense, he's a little bit different from Arthur Miller, who has a salesman as his tragic hero. Williams also wants a bit of the Greek side. Now, comedy. This is really important. There are elements of comedy in there. Tennessee Williams says in an interview in 1974, one cannot write a tragedy today without putting humor into it. We know that Aristotle would have said that this is taboo, wouldn't he? So again, if you're thinking about, say, Othello, there's definitely elements of comedy in Othello, isn't there? And Williams wouldn't have a problem with that. We see, don't we, that Blanche's theatricality is funny. When she says to Mitch he's the Rosencavalier, and we know that he's a big galumph, and he's inelegant and sweating and perspiring, and he's certainly no Rosencavalier, is he? There are even elements of comedy in scene 10 that precede the rape. Now, what I say here is the amusement turning to horror is very effective in dramatic terms. And I think that you could write a little bit about that in terms of performance, okay? Now, Kazan wanted you to, Kazan is notorious for being quite hostile to Blanche, and he wanted you to see her as dangerous. She comes into the home as the invader, and she disrupts the household. Blanche is dangerous, he tells us. That's really important, okay? And indeed, it is fair to say that Blanche's flaws are numerous. Vanity, narcissism, her awful snobbery, her racism, which we see immediately, don't we, with Eunice, etc. She's deceitful, she's a manipulator, and she has disturbing pedophilic tendencies. But I also want you to remember that the play is not binary. My class last time fell into this trap. Stanley and Blanche are not polar opposites. You have a quote like this: Blanche is a soul trapped in a flesh-celebrating world. Well, that's not entirely true. We know that Blanche has also embraced the flesh. And look at this beautiful quote that shows Stella's not as stupid as the comic reading person that she seems to be. Because when Blanche says to her, it's just desire, brutal desire, it's just like the rattle-trap streetcar, Stella very cleverly replies, haven't you ever ridden on that streetcar? And we know that Blanche has ridden on that streetcar more than anyone. So the idea that Blanche is not carnal is wrong. It's far more complex than that. Blanche's idea of being the sweet virgin, artistically brilliant person is fiction. It's a chimera, isn't it? It's her shield. Beneath that, she's engaged in kind of nymphomania, in dipsomania. She has every vice under the sun. Now, this is very important. I've called this tragedy and the toxic matter of the past. And this is a quote from Adrian Poole in Tragedy, a very short introduction. And this will then take us into the passages. Yet, in a broad sense, tragedy deals with toxic matter bequeathed by the past to the present. That's very interesting. That he's kind of using almost a Freudian lens there, where he's seen tragedy as the return of the repressed. That which we try to stamp down, which Blanche does with Alan Gray, returns, and as Freud tells us, when we repress a memory, it will return as a neurotic symptom, won't it? And it will avenge itself on the person. Don't forget that Tennessee Williams is a big reader of Freud and a very big reader of D.H. Lawrence, who is one of the most Freudian-inspired novelists to date. Now, I don't know if my music is good. Just to remind you of the outside. Oh, I can't find it now. I had my polka music here, but I can't play it. I wanted to remind you how ghastly the polka music is, and how, it would, that speaker's not working. If the polka music was working, you would realize that it has a kind of crazy, jollity to it that reminds me of when you go and see a psycho killer film, and before he murders the woman, he sings a little lullaby. It's the discordance, isn't it? It's that idea of kind of aristocratic joy and the conjuring of the Old South, which has now become diseased and distorted and symbolic of Alan Gray. It is the music of distress for Blanche. We are not told this until scene 6. So we have this eerie, surreal experience in the beginning where we don't know what this music means. It's key to Williams' plastic theatre, and it helps, as I say here, give the play some of the complexity, the psychological complexity of the novel. I also think that it is at the heart of the tragedy and why we as an audience are able to experience Blanche's distress, panic, and psychological disintegration. It is truly a brilliant inclusion, and I think without it, the play would not be as strong as it is. So we inhabit Blanche's mind right from the beginning. When William sets the scene and speaks of the infatuated brown fingers, we feel Blanche's fear, don't we? We see the racial dog whistle there to the jazz and the fear of African American sexuality and the beautiful term infatuated, as though these are people combining sex and music. How different from the polka, which is all about European kind of decorum, etc., and the relationship, the asexual relationship with Alan Gray. And now I'm going to begin with the passage on Alan Gray. And I'm going to give you guys a quick minute to look at the next two slides before I do some analysis, okay? Okay, so that was a very quick little look at Alan Gray just because I want to get through this particular section, okay? So, with Alan Gray, we begin with the locomotive approaching outside. Is it there or not? We don't know. In all likelihood, not. She clasps her hands to her ears and crouches. The headlight of the locomotive glares into the room. So in that sense, it isn't really there, is it? We get a sense of the absolute terror. If we're going down the contextual thing, we're talking now about a kind of industrialized age, aren't we? And the fact that Blanche's aristocratic agricultural world of Thomas Jefferson is dead, okay? Afterwards, we pretended that nothing had been discovered. She's now telling the story. She's telling it to Mitchell. First of all, telling it to Mitchell is rather sad, isn't it? Because Mitchell has no ability to empathize with her whatsoever. Yes, the three of us drove out to the Moon Lake Casino, very drunk and laughing all the way. Here we see theatrical Blanche going into character. But look, the polka sound comes in a minor key. Obviously, a minor key doesn't ring as heavily in our head. The transference from minor to major key brilliantly captures the intensification of Blanche's distress. We dance the Vesuviana. Suddenly, in the middle of the dance, the boy I'd married broke away from me and ran out of the casino. A few minutes later, a shot. Delayed narration, brilliantly done. We see the distress first and we don't understand why. We see the polka stop at that moment there, as though the music stops for her. But then Blanche rises and look, the polka switches to a major key. So we get that brilliant use of music to convey the increase of her distress. In a sense, the haunting by Alan Gray is what Blanche runs from and what has taken Blanche to Elysian Fields. She sways and covers her face. It was because on the dance floor, unable to stop myself, I suddenly said, I know, you disgust me. And there we have Blanche's sin. Now, in terms of the tragedy then, the crime, like the crime of Oedipus Rex, has occurred earlier in the prehistory of the play. We also learn here that the searchlight, the importance of light, that Alan Gray switched the light on for her, this extraordinary relationship that she couldn't quite comprehend. Also now his death will switch the light off for her. Mitch gets up awkwardly and moves towards her a little. The polka music increases, and then Mitch enfolds her in her arms. Now, it's brilliant, because it puts together the epic, the beautiful, with the actual kind of mundane of realism. She's looking for Shep Huntley. She's looking to go back to Alan Gray, who's this kind of ethereal, almost Shelley-like romantic poet. Who does she have? She has big, lumbering Mitch, the machinist. So we see, even in this moment of hope that's going to follow now, that moment of hope is so short-lived. This kind of window of opportunity of rescue is really a vain moment. And we, the audience, feel that pain because we can feel the inevitability of the tragedy. So when Blanche delivers this beautiful line, second only, I think, to I've always believed in the kindness of strangers, sometimes there's God so quickly. This beautiful line of comfort, this moment of comfort that we retreat to, that will be underscored immediately in scene 7 and scene 8, where we have, Shaw giving all the details of Blanche's promiscuity, and we have Stanley directing his hatred at her. We have this tiny little window here, and then it's gone. So Alan Gray is really the nemesis, even more than Stanley, is he not? Arguably, the catastrophe has already occurred. There is a catastrophe in scene 10. But what really wreaks havoc on Blanche's mind, it is this moment that haunts her the most, isn't it? And it's her sense of guilt. Now, on this recording, I cannot speak too much about the love that dare not speak its name, okay? But clearly that is absolutely central to this play, and this is kind of closet drama at its best, and I'm using the term closet there in the way that I think you know. Now, do we blame Blanche for this? It would be absurd to. She's a young teenage girl growing up in Christian fundamentalist deep south who has no conception of this lifestyle and acts instinctively in horror at something that she saw. But she feels this is Blanche's original sin that she's going to pay for, okay? And of course, this scene is what shattered her illusion of marriage. She was attracted to his femininity, to his poetry. And what she didn't realize is what that actually meant. So the play after this essentially becomes a story of haunting. Blanche is then catapulted down a destructive path, which is what we find out about the Flamingo Hotel, or the Tarantula Arms, as she calls it, the hideous kind of nymphomania of her various affairs with soldiers while she's at Belle-Rive, etc. And so the alcohol, the sedatives, the sex, the pedophilia, the self-abuse is explained, isn't it? This is the wound, the gaping wound that she already appears in New Orleans with, which is why I feel that Blanche's wound has gone gangrene even before she gets there. She is doomed from the moment. So that's why I see Stanley as the final trigger, not the reason. And I think, again, I'll say that Williams, a keen reader of Freud and D.H. Lawrence, very interested in the destructive effects of repression, etc. And now I'm going to move quickly on to the catastrophe in scene 10, the actual rape. Kazan and Williams were determined that the rape was shown. Now, Williams partly gets his way in the 1951 film that you guys have all seen. The rape has been played in very different ways, sometimes incredibly graphically. And Kazan said it's absolutely essential to play the rape scene. If you want a macho man in this piece, it's Stanley. The story of the latter half of the play is Stanley doggedly hunting her down, down, down into the ground, and finally makes her dirt by taking her against his will. So we understand the rape as an act of discipline, don't we? You'll notice just before the rape, Blanche has a beautiful speech in which she talks about the value of art and sophistication and how she has all of these timeless things. She speaks the kind of Othello-like speech of, spirituality and cosmic imagery, etc. And what happens? Stanley rubs her face in the immediate present. He destroys and dismantles the world of art and illusion, and he makes her dirty. We know that after Alan, she bathes to get clean. Mitch is the first person to make her dirty, and then Stanley makes her filthy, so that she is so contaminated like Lady Macbeth that she will never wash off the grime that Stanley puts on her. And Stanley's revenge is pointed, it is deliberate, and it is without sexual passion. I think that's the key thing. It's an act of discipline and rage. We now move on to the sea. Blanche says, "Don't come in here." We have the lurid reflections, don't we? Operator, she's on the telephone, isn't she? There's nobody there. I want to get in touch with Mr. Shep Huntley, also an important figure in the play. Another absent male figure in the play. Another male chivalric person, entirely illusionary. A person who is there as a desperate attempt to give her a way out from this bear trap that she's in. And look at this bit over here. The night is filled with inhuman cries. sort of voices like cries in the jungle, shadows, lurid reflections. The back of the wall of the rooms has become transparent. What happens outside? A prostitute has rolled a drunk. Wow. This is using that Milziner set, isn't it? So when you're writing, guys, you're going to write about the set, aren't you? You're going to think about what's happening, the sounds, the sense of the urban howl and jungle, the sense of race, the sense of jazz and blues piano that is there to absolutely terrify Blanche. Some moments later, a Negro woman appears round the corner with a sequin bag, which the prostitute has dropped. This is a dog-eat-dog world, isn't it? And it fits in with the whole theme of survival. So one of the key things that Williams does is he's writing in a kind of post-Darwin world, and he makes Darwinian ideas part of the modern tragedy. What happens to the people who can't adapt? What happens to the Blanches? They get crushed, as we see here. I won't go too much into this. This is a very little, I'll make this PowerPoint available to you, but you can play this scene in many different ways. So if you look at the 2014 version with Gillian Anderson, she is completely wrecked by the time he comes in with her makeup all smeared, and he pulls her dress over her head, and the rape is graphic to really emphasize the physicality and the smashing and the hurt of her. So don't forget that part of the drama is you visualizing those scenes, yeah? And now, in terms of the denouement, which is my final part of the talk today, you'll be glad to hear. So the denouement, the untying of things. Well, one of the things that we could say straight away is that this is a play without a real denouement. Because the denouement of tragedy, as we know from Othello, is death, isn't it? But in a sense, Blanche is not dead. She's going to have a living death, isn't she? In a ghastly institution. Tennessee Williams knew about this very much. Heartbreaking contextual pointers, even when he was poor, in the end, through drink and drugs and stuff, Tennessee Williams kept his sister Rose in the most expensive psychiatric unit in the United States. He was absolutely devastated by what happened to her. And another contextual point would be that this is a free municipal asylum, and therefore, guys, it will be a terrifying place. And the matron represents this. And this is an agonizing moment in terms of the tragedy. Some of the girls here who've got beautiful nails will understand the pain of having your nails cut down like they did in my Catholic school to the girls, yes? The matron is going to infantilize her, take her female sexuality away, her clothes, etc. This is Blanche's only armor will be stripped from her, won't they? And then that's why there's a beautiful kind of binary opposition between the doctor and the matron. The doctor, let go. He draws her up gently and supports her with his arm and leads her through the Poitiers. Whoever you are, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. What a beautiful line. What does Arthur Miller say about it? Arthur Miller, who was writing at the same time as Tennessee Williams, over more than half a century, I can still recall the inhaling of breath, lovely quote for you to remember, across the auditorium when Blanche said the kindness of strangers. When she exited on the arm of the doctor, everyone went with her. And that's true. The essence of tragedy, pity and fear, is something that we feel at that particular point. Is it cathartic? Well, that's another question. Is there a moment of anagnoresis? No, there's not. Because Blanche exits, unlike Othello, who kills himself with full knowledge of the enormity of his crimes, Blanche exits into a world of delusion. If we take the Aristotelian view, then somehow it can't be a tragedy. But clearly Williams didn't feel that that was an important element of tragedy. And I would be inclined to argue that being deluded as you're going out to live entirely in a world of illusions and shadows is deeply, deeply tragic. If you are to write about the tragedy, you must write about the coda of the play, okay? The coda, the end of the play. Blanche, Blanche, Stella. Remember, Stella, tragedy is very much enhanced by betrayal. And Stella is a betrayer, is she not? She willfully decides to ignore Blanche's story, doesn't she? Okay? So we have here, Eunice descends to Stella and places the child in her arms. Highly symbolic, isn't it? Death and life. Stella is on the side of life. She has survived. She is metamorphosized from the Belle Reve, dying south. She is now a breeder and a fertile person. She belongs in the world of the living as her sister goes into the living death. Okay? This is a beautiful, amazing piece. Because we have that lovely moment. We could have finished there, I've always believed, with the kindness of strangers. But now he's going to undercut it with brutish realism. And Stanley, at this moment, is thinking sex, as Blanche goes to her kind of metaphorical death. We have Stella sobs with inhuman abandonment. And Stanley, notice, voluptuously, very carefully chosen adverb there. Now, honey, now. He kneels beside her, and he finds the opening of her blouse. And here, the swelling of the blue piano and that trumpet, which is the kind of sexuality lurking in the background, is there. And then possibly the greatest line of the play. The game is 7-card stud. Now, I'm not a great poker player, but I know that that is a game of complete chance in which luck plays a far greater role. And is Tennessee Williams giving us a little wink to the fates there with the card playing? I would say yes. This is a little intertextual allusion to Greek drama and to the fact that life is a game of chance. There are winners and there are losers. And in this case, Blanche has been an absolute loser. Before I hand over, I'm just going to point out there are a couple of things that I will just show you very quickly. I think that these would be interesting questions. Explore the view that Blanche learns nothing from her painful experience. Mahika did this essay for me recently. It's an interesting one to do. What I would say is it's sometimes hard to find a counter-argument. I think I've said this in my last minute video to you, but I'll say it again now. You must always have a counter-argument. If the counter-argument is weak, say it. Just say, another way of seeing it would be this, blah, 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 blah. However, this view is problematic for the following reasons. And that's why this reading is stronger. If you don't do it, though, you can't get better than a C. So you make sure that you put a counter-argument in there. And if it's weak, it's fine. You say why it's weak. Ali? So I spoke briefly there about the importance of the counter. Here's another one that's really interesting. The past poisons the present. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Well, here again, I think the counter could be as well that we also have Stanley in the present as well. But you could say overwhelmingly this is the case. So don't forget, it doesn't have to be like 50-50 in the argument, guys. It could be like sort of 70-30, but just bring in another way of looking at it, even if you're just going to say that is not an effective or strong reading of the play, okay? The final one that I thought would be interesting for you is that the tragedy of A Streetcar Named Desire is exclusively linked to the historical context. Probably harder than anything you get in the exam, but it would be quite interesting for you to just think in your mind now that Williams deliberately did various things in this play to make sure that they transcended the present in which he wrote. He uses the genre of tragedy, doesn't he? He gives Blanche a kind of epic quality. And again, I will just talk about the importance in this particular play of this Hegel idea of a clash of values, a clash of worlds. And when I'm trying to conceptualize tragedy, I would just think about how important it is that these characters represent something far greater than they do simply as characters. Okay, over and out from me.